hello, and welcome to Breaking Down the Biz, everyone. These are conversations about how the music and entertainment and tech business actually works, from insiders who've shaped it and who have not just talked the talk, but walked the walk. I'm your host, Seth Schachner with Strat Americas. I'm glad that everyone's here today. Today, we're going to talk about music journalism, past and present. For decades out in the industry, you discovered music in a couple of different ways. You may have heard it on the radio. You went to a concert. Some of you might have watched it on MTV, and certainly plenty of us have read about it in a publication. As one of the main arms of music marketing, reviews that came into places like Rolling Stone and Billboard kind of set the course for hundreds of artists throughout the decades. But I don't really think in today's modern media landscape, print journalism is necessarily the giant it once was. Paper, print gave way to blogs, to articles, how we learn about artists. And how we learn about those artists has become probably a lot more fractured and dispersed than ever. So what I want to talk about today with a very special guest is how has journalism adapted in this new era, of algorithms, of social media, how it plays out into the greater entertainment industry ecosystem as well. And so to give us some insights into this great history, into the impact is someone who's been very special to me, who I've known for more than a couple decades. We just found out 4, actually. Oh my God. Ira Robbins, welcome. Ira founded something called Trouser Press in 1974. From humble beginnings as a handout fanzine in front of places like New York's Palladium and other clubs in the mid-'70s, Trouser Press really grew into a touchstone for rock, punk, and indie criticism. So welcome, Ira. Glad you're here.
Thank you, Seth. Nice to see you again after all these years.
Oh my God! We were just chatting before we got on that my first gig in the biz, if you will, was at an arm of Rolling Stone, and Ira was my first boss. So around about this time, I was typically just getting lunch for Ira, right? And I still remember the way you liked your coffee. Okay.
It was just great for me to have somebody there with me. I was editing this book, the Rolling Stone
Press
Guy, 1985. Rolling Stone, The Year in Rock, 1985. And, it was a really weird project. They kind of threw me in the deep end and gave me a little office off the art department of Rolling Stone on Fifth Avenue. And just said sort of, okay, put the book together. And I'm like, So they gave me an intern. I'm not sure how you came about to be my intern, but I appreciated the company and the having somebody to bounce ideas off of. So I'm grateful to you as well.
Likewise, it made a lot of difference. So got a good discussion in front of us today. Could you talk to us a little bit about how did Trouser Press come about in the New York and the Manhattan music scene in the mid-'70s?
In 1973, I was a college student. I was attending engineering school. I'd already been a lifelong rock and roll fan at that point, ever since hearing Hats Off to Larry by Dale Shannon when I was 6. And so I met a guy in high school called Dave Schultz at the Bronx High School of Science. And we bonded over our love of The Who and a bunch of other bands and glam rock and things like that. And we went to this guy's house in Yonkers, which is a suburb north of the Bronx in New York. And it was like a record hop. We're talking about the Kinks and the Yardbirds and the Rolling Stones records, rarities and stuff. It was just kind of like a record collector thing. And we met this woman who had been the editor of the Brooklyn College newspaper. And we got to talking. And somehow out of that, we decided that, we should start a magazine. Not for any particular reason, just, kind of out of the desire to share our opinions and to say the things that we, to tell people about the stuff we were excited about.
Yeah.
And took a couple of months to get the idea off the ground. But in March of 74, so 52 years ago this month, we stapled a bunch of copies together. We mimeographed the pages and stapled them together and went out in front of the Academy of Music on East 14th Street and sold them in front of a Rory Gallagher concert.
Wow. Okay.
And the price was $0.25. And I guess we sold about 100 copies. And we were kind of off to the races.
Awesome. Where did the name come from?
The Bonzo Dog Band, who was a big favorite of Dave and mine, had a song called "Do the Trouser Press," and the pun being that they would actually perform it on stage with an ironing board. But a trouser press is a British invention that is used to flatten pants and put a crease in pants. But it's basically two boards that you screw together. It's very traditional. They now make them electric and they have ultraviolet and everything. But in the old days, they were just two boards. And so the Bonzos, who were very funny about stuff like that, did a song called Trouser Press. And we like the pun of press, for
right.
the music press. But we expanded on it. We went way further. We called it the Transoceanic Trouser Press because
Mm.
we were going to focus on British music, and because the British TV show Top of the Pops was initialized TOTP. And so we wanted to call ourselves TOTP. And on top of that, just for one more stupid thing, the Kinks had a song about the Top of the Pops called TOTP. So we wanted to do that as well. So it was all those stupid things all glued together, and we had to live with it for the next 10 years. We got rid of the Transoceanic after a year or two.
Was a lot of thought into it, obviously. So this is the mid 70s, 74. So this
Yeah.
wasn't like, this was way before punk or alternative. What was, I mean, Mott the Hoople, was it before Bowie? What were sort of the bands around at the time that were influences that led you to create it as well?
Well, The Who primarily, but also, yeah, Bowie and Sparks and Roxy Music and The Move and Wizard and Small Faces. We were kind of an amalgam of 60s British rock and 70s British rock. But the funny thing is that at the same time, punk hadn't happened yet, but in 1974, 75, we were going to shows in New York at Max's Kansas City and CBGB by some of the bands that became famous later.
Mm.
So like it just hadn't reached any critical mass at that point. But
Yeah.
so, our enthusiasm was really British rock of the 60s and 70s. It was kind of a weird time in 74, 75 because British rock had kind of like the glam era was pretty much ending, like Slade were kind of over and, T-Rex was over. And like the exciting stuff hadn't really happened yet. So it was kind of like a lot of really kind of mainstreamy sort of bands. I mean, like Sutherland Brothers and Quiver were big, and then of course there's prog rock, which we hated.
Oh, you didn't like art rock?
No, we liked art rock. We didn't like prog rock.
Okay.
Roxy Music, sure, but like there was a lot of chart stuff in England that was just kind of weird. But like 74 was like Bebop Deluxe and Cockney Rebel, and so we got excited about that. We kind of started one way, and then we kind of geared into, through a couple of occurrences, we geared into like record collecting as a kind of a focus of the magazine. So we would run these extremely detailed discographies with like serial numbers and catalog numbers and, not quite Discogs.com level of nerddom, but sort of leaning in that direction. But then a couple of years in, sort of British stuff start getting exciting. So with like Dr. Feelgood and Eddie and the Hot Rods, and then into like the Damned and the Sex Pistols and the Clash. So by like 76, 77, we kind of had become like a new wave magazine, a punk magazine.
But just, I mean, I'll probably state the obvious, and we'll go up to the present. And I want to talk about that later in the discussion. But I don't know, other genres. Hip hop wasn't around, obviously, but say R&B or country or just American rock or even any type of, whether it's metal or other, that wasn't cool, or that wasn't part of what inspired you to do this.
No, we were merciless snobs. We have absolutely, I mean, not only, I mean, we liked what we liked, and we elected ourselves to be critics. And so part of criticism for us was to have a perspective and to have a value system and to have a kind of a hierarchy of what was good and what was bad. And, we weren't alone in this. A lot of critics in those days took real hate, like made hatred a real part of like their view of music. I mean, like there's stuff you absolutely loved and stuff you absolutely hated. It wasn't enough to like shrug off like a song like American Pie. You had to like basically turn the radio off every time it came on and like walk out of restaurants if they were playing it, and then, tell people why it was the most obnoxious piece of disgusting drivel that had ever been recorded. But you're absolutely right though. We very much decided that we were going to focus on the stuff that we liked, which meant basically no black music, no country music, no heavy metal, no folk music. I mean, we were very, very focused on British rock. And that got us in trouble. I mean, in a way, because eventually Robert Christgau, the dean of American rock critics, called us out for being racist, because we didn't cover any music that wasn't white. We did actually. That was a lie. I mean, we covered like bands like Thin Lizzy, and it didn't matter to us that they were black. It just only mattered that they were playing rock music. So we never thought of ourselves as doing anything wrong. We just thought that we were focusing on what we cared about, and nobody elected us to be the voice of all popular music. I mean, a magazine like Rolling Stone has a much different obligation than we did.
And that's what I wanted to talk about. When you think, I mean, what was around? Was it Rolling Stone, Cream, Spin,
Circus,
Melody Maker, Circus?
Yeah.
So, how were you distinct from all of these other rock publications?
We were littler.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we saw ourselves. In fact, we advertised ourselves initially as the alternative to the alternatives. Our idea was that there was stuff that these magazines didn't want to cover, weren't interested in, and had no curiosity about, and we were going to step in and do that. We didn't see ourselves as competition. We saw ourselves as filling a gap.
Mm.
So, I mean, in mid-'70s, I didn't even read Rolling Stone. I mean, like, they existed, but they were like, it was as if you were like the Kansas City Gazette, and somebody said, well, what about the New York Times? It's like, well, that's a different world. We're not
Yeah.
playing with them. We're not worrying about them. So I mean, Rolling Stone, I mean, we wrote for all those magazines on and off, but in terms of what we were doing, we didn't care at all what they were doing. Then punk magazines started, and then the New York Rocker had preceded them, and so those were real things that we were not concerned about, we were interested in and engaged with. And they were local. They were both based in New York, like we were. And so, we knew those people, and we kind of looked over our shoulders at them. And occasionally we would be jealous or angry or, greedy about things. But by and large, we just all coexisted. There was plenty of room for all of us.
Oh, that's cool. So when you started out, I mean, the vision for it, editorially, was it reviews? Was it pure music journalism? Was it a fanzine? Was it some combination of all those, or?
It was definitely a fanzine. I mean, because that just basically means that it was an amateurish, small time, cheaply produced, oddly distributed project. So we were definitely a fanzine, but our goal was to review records and write feature articles about bands that we cared about. And we had this big marketing concept, which we abandoned after 6 months or so, which was to put people on the cover who were playing gigs in New York that we could sell in front of. So like literally, we put The Who on the first cover because there was a Who concert that we were going to go to. And then we put Mott the Hoople on the second cover because there was a Mott the Hoople concert. So that was our guiding editorial principle for cover stories for a while. That lasted up till the middle of the year, I think.
I mean, you started out selling it for a quarter, so it wasn't exactly an advanced business strategy, but that presumably evolved over time to advertising and subscriptions, yeah?
Yeah. I mean, subscriptions was something that we kind of realized pretty early on would keep us alive. Selling magazines into record stores, into bookstores, and newsstands was difficult. It required both reaching out to people, finding them, making business arrangements with them, collecting money, shipping magazines or delivering them. I mean, we actually would spend a day every month, running around New York with a shopping cart, dropping off copies of the magazine.
Wow.
Which is, a terrible way of doing business. But so subscriptions were good for us. And then, somewhere along the road, we decided that we could put flexi discs in the magazine. And so the big idea that we had was to put flexi discs only in copies that subscribers got. So we did split runs at the printer, and we bound in the flexi discs only in the subscriber copies, which made the subscriptions a very appealing. You could only get the flexi discs if you subscribed. So that was a real good marketing strategy.
What was a flexi disc? You mean a record with music on it, an actual piece of vinyl, or?
It's not vinyl. It's this very thin little piece of plastic that was, the generation gap here, Seth.
I'm loving it. This is why we have the episode. It's okay.
Flexi. There was a company in Florida called, I forget what they were called, and they made flexi discs, and they were like flexible pieces of very thin plastic, kind of like not cellophane, but sort of like thickness of like piece of cardboard.
Yeah, all right, like urethane or something like that, like what goes into skateboard wheels or whatever.
Something like that. And they could literally press a record on it. So it was a 45, it was a 8x8, 45 record, and we could press it on both sides, and it had a lip attached to it that we could bind into the magazine. And so what we did was we made a deal with record companies, and they would sponsor the flexi disc for us. They would give us the music and pay us like a small amount of money, like $1,000.
Yeah.
And we would bind, and for them it was a promotional opportunity. So, we got like OMD and Joan Jett and Japan, a lot of epic acts.
Yeah.
Human Switchboard once, just a lot of odd bands. And so we would have one in every issue, and only for subscribers. So that really built up our subscription base.
Yeah. And so just I want to touch on New York a little bit because it's so vital to understanding the story. But, I mean, late 70s, right? Was it 77, 78? The punk explosion happened on both sides of the Atlantic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we had some bands, some Blondie, Talking Heads, Ramones. I'll go through the whole list, Lou Reed. Were you close to the artist or just to the explosion? Did you feel like it was part of what helped Trouser Press grow and develop?
We were close to the artist in some cases. I mean, we knew a lot of the people because like CBGB's scene was very small. Like if you went to CBGB, like you didn't have to like worry about the security guy at the backstage door. If you wanted to talk to Joey Ramone, you just went up to the bar and he was sitting there at the bar. So, everybody knew everybody, and, people liked us. And so we got along, but, we didn't really take advantage of that, or really, we had this we had a kind of a stupid idea, which was that because we wanted to be a national magazine, and we had distribution, well outside of New York, we didn't want to focus on New York because none of these bands had records out at the time. This is
Mm.
like maybe Patti Smith did, but the Ramones record didn't come out until 76. And so, we didn't see ourselves writing about bands that you literally couldn't hear if you didn't live in New York. I mean, they
Mm.
didn't tour, those bands. They played a little bit outside New York, but they didn't regularly tour. They didn't have record company deals. And there was no, internet or anything like that to put music on Bandcamp. So, the upshot was that we kind of looked around and said, well, this is only our scene. This is like in Manhattan. Like why would somebody in, Nebraska want to read about the Ramones who don't have a record out? But it turned
Mm.
out that that was a really dumb way to look at it, because in fact people were curious, and had we covered them, it probably would have been good for everybody. But we finally got around to it. But once they became a little more prominent, we jumped right in. So we did a lot of stories on Blondie and the Ramones. We were pretty good friends with Blondie. In fact, the keyboard player in Blondie, Jimmy Destry, had been in my band before he joined Blondie.
Yeah.
And, we knew the Ramones, and we knew Talking Heads a little bit. Well, not so much them, but, like I say, it was a scene, and everybody knew everybody. But then, the New York Rocker came along and Punk Magazine came along, and all they focused on were those bands.
I see.
So it kind of took we kind of, in a way, we sort of left it to them, but, we covered them as we felt we
Yeah.
needed to.
But, I grew up around this time too, and I want to get to some of the power pop bands that came after the Beatles. But there was, I try and tell my kids this, like, and they snicker at me, but how less media and how less platforms there were out there, right? I mean, I had
Yeah.
kind of crappy radio in DC where I grew up, and then MTV came along around 82 or something like that. But there wasn't even half as much. You mentioned Bandcamp. There was really nothing, beyond some of these very defined like print mediums and radio and TV. I wonder what that meant for you. Did you have any other allies outside of the print business that you were building, or?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we really focused on for a long time was the America Underground, which was like people making their own records. So there was a cassette culture for a while. I mean, people would put out cassettes because that was the cheapest thing you could do. You could make one. You could record it in your bedroom and you could make a copy and send it to somebody. So we were always incredibly open about reviewing anything that existed. So we viewed our role as being, open to anybody that made music who we liked, who we thought was interesting or valuable. So it was easy, the cassette culture, and then people started putting out 45s of their own, and then the fanzine culture. We reviewed fanzines to kind of help spread the word about them. I mean, there were a lot of alternative ways of getting the word out, none of them anything like what exists today, but it was a very slow little piddly ass process. You could put an ad in the back of Trousers. We would let bands advertise for very, very low rates because if they were selling their own records, because we wanted to encourage that. What happened essentially was an entire alternative industry grew up. College radio spawned like booking agencies and clubs and
Hmm.
fanzines and record labels and promotion departments and publicity companies and things like that. And so management companies. And we looked at the record industry as it was and said, they're never going to pay attention to what we want them to pay attention to us. And
Mhm.
so we'll just do it ourselves. I mean, DIY was totally, the watchword. Everything was DIY. It was like, nobody's going to do this for you, because for decades, the view of the record industry had been like, oh, please, sir, sign me up and let me make a record for you. And then, once we realized that was never going to happen for 99% of the bands that we thought were good and should have record contracts, everybody just kind of like jumped into the pool and started doing it for themselves, figuring out how to ignore the record companies and make their own music without having to require somebody to let you do that. Now, ironically, and I don't mean to jump forward too far into the story, but ironically, that's essentially exactly what happened when the internet came along and destroyed music journalism.
Yeah.
Because everybody was kind of like, oh, I can do this myself. What do I need
Right.
what do I need Rolling Stone to decide what's important?
Right. So I mean, before we jump into that, because there's a ton of stuff I want to get your take on there.
Okay.
But just to set it in context, Trouser Press you didn't have to pivot to digital, right? You were a classic sort of print publication, and give our viewers, listeners, a sense of how you maintained your identity. You didn't become digital. Is that fair to say?
No, I mean
Okay.
the magazine died before there was digital. I mean, we ended in 1984. There hadn't email didn't exist at that point. I mean, I understand how hard it is for people who grew up in the last 20, 30 years to not have any understanding of what it was like in the before time. But I mean, Trouser Press did adapt ultimately. I mean, there's been a Trouser Press website for 30 some odd years now.
Yeah.
So, Trouser Press has a digital footprint for sure, but the magazine ended long before we had to decide whether we would go digital or not.
Well, so when you look out at the digital journalism landscape for music right now, whether it's Pitchfork or even bigger publications like the New York Times or Rolling Stone, I mean, how do you see it? As a completely different landscape than when you were in it, or do the same sort of fundamentals still apply?
I would think that journalism is a pretty eternal concept. I think, what's really changed is not so much the delivery system of serious journalism organizations. What's really changed is the plethora of non-journalism organizations inhabiting the same space. Pitchfork doing what Pitchfork does is fine. I mean, it's exactly what any music magazine did, just not using paper. But that's not the same as, 1,000 people going on YouTube and going like, "Hey, my name's Bob. Here's a record I listened to yesterday. It's really fucking cool." And having that be what people think is music journalism, because it's not. Just circling back a little bit, if you really want to know how long ago the Trouser Press era was, such as it was, we didn't exist when there was digital publishing. So
Mhm.
when we put together our magazine, is with T-squares, paper, printed type,
Mhm.
glue or wax, red colored acrylic in order to block out where the photos went. I mean, you have
Right.
no idea how essentially rudimentary. So of course, it was one step up um, hot
Uh-huh.
type, from
Uh-huh.
typesetting, but still, it was a very arduous process. And had we existed in the era when you could, flow an article on a page on your screen and then just ship it to the printer that way. I mean, we had to carry huge boxes of negatives for the issue to the printer. And not even to the printer, to the printer's office, who would then ship them on a plane to the printer. And, incredibly Byzantine, complicated manual process. We once actually had a plane go down carrying our negatives on the way
Oh
to the
my
printer,
god.
and we had to have them reproduced,
Oh
which
my
threw us
god.
off by a couple of weeks.
Right.
Even the most rudimentary thing of somebody delivering a review that you're going to run, they had to bring it to our office on a piece of paper, and someone had to type it in. I mean, when I was a freelance writer, part of my day would be getting on the subway and going to Rolling Stone to drop off my article or
Right,
my
right.
review. Now it's oh yeah, it's 11 o'clock at night. Yeah, I guess I'm done. Okay, here, I'll send it off. Click.
Okay. All right, that's a great spot for us just to do a very quick break. We're going to be right back with Ira Robbins, music journalist, Trouser Press. Stay right there. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back with Breaking Down the Biz and rock journalist Ira Robbins from Trouser Press. I want to talk for this piece of the pod about, now versus then, not just operationally and logistically, because it sounds wildly different. But, I want to get your take, Ira, on whether the profession is still very much alive and if it's uncompromised. I mean, or is it so totally different now that audiences are all over the place and there's a lot of other factors to consider before you raise your voice and speak your mind? Is it the same thing, or is it completely different these days?
It's completely different. The first thing that happened was the possibility of earning a living as a freelance music journalist basically ended. There are still some, but not very many. That used to be a fairly manageable way to make a living, and it's not anymore. Another thing that happened was the ability to measure readership in a way that never was available to print publications. The idea that you need to be appealing to your audience in a way that doesn't turn them off or make them feel, belittled or rejected has led to a lot of very optimistic, very positive views of things. The idea being why would you write about something that isn't any good? Whereas the idea of criticism, and I am a diehard purist when it comes to the idea of criticism. The idea of criticism is to basically process creativity for better or worse, to really think about it, to analyze it, to contextualize it, and then to put it into a way that people can react to it and give them some understanding of what you know about it and what they might think about it. You're not telling people what to think. You're telling people what you think, how it might help them think about what they want to do. Ever since USA Today started dumbing down news journalism for people, which goes back a pretty far way, that created an environment in which the readership became the leader rather than the follower.
Mm,
Journalism traditionally was an elite business. It was kind of like, we are going to tell you what we have learned,
mm,
and you're going to consume it, and you're going to deal with it and respond to it, and perhaps not like it, but maybe you'll learn something. Trouser Press, we used a lot of big words, and we were not shamed about that. We were just happy to say, look it up. Like, you're grown up, figure it out. We never talk down to people. And I think that the USA Today, post USA Today era is very much not being very careful not to talk down to people. The
mm.
idea that you will alienate your readership if you confuse them. And I wrote for Entertainment Weekly for a long time, and they were very much of that mindset that you had to be very careful about not leading your readers. Not giving them stuff that they don't know about. So there was a lot of explaining stuff, which I understand that a magazine has a 5 million circulation. You're not going to have this kind of concentrated readership that you can expect to know certain things. But at the same time, there's nothing really wrong with having people be curious and having people having to look things up occasionally, or
Yeah.
maybe not understand something. So I think music journalism has become a victim of that in a lot of ways, because there isn't the concentrated audience where who your readers are, because now anybody who clicks on a website is your reader, and
Yeah.
and exactly by the metrics how many of those people have clicked on your website. And so I think there's a lot of very anxious worrying about whether people like what you're doing or not. Whereas
Yeah.
you publish a magazine, it's a discrete object. You if you pay $2 for the magazine, that's all you have. That's the only thing the magazine needs to know, is you bought that issue. Whether they liked the article on page 3 or not, hated the review on page 27, none of it matters. If they made the decision to buy it. But with the internet, everything's fragmentary. It's like, well, they didn't click on my article. So, I'm going to lose my job now because they didn't click on my article. So that's an entirely different mindset. So everybody's kind of in it for themselves now, of like, oh my God, my article has to be really, really upbeat and happy so that people want
Yeah.
to read it. There's whole websites devoted to happy news.
Right, right. Or fake news. But what about, I'll use the Spinal Tap analogy. If someone makes a really crappy record, can't you just say this is like with Shark Sandwich, this is a shit sandwich, or with, and just say this is terrible, or it just doesn't happen anymore?
Well, it does. But it doesn't happen as often in the context of publications, online publications, in which the assignments go to people who are already inclined towards something, right? Most editors now, but editing is a thing that's really degraded as well. And in my day, well, at some day, editing was a much more demanding enterprise. Now it's kind of like, well, who likes this record that can write about it? Who likes this band that could go on tour with them? Or who's got a really good in with this label? And I think that's really part of the problem, that that there isn't that independence. If you're pitching articles, you know, in the old days, you would pitch an article or a review without telling the editor what you thought of it. In fact, you
Mm,
hadn't heard it. But now, since you can hear everything online, right? You can get your watermarked, downloads, a month before. It's a very different environment. I'm not trying to
no,
damn everybody. I'm sure there's lots of people doing really good work, and there are good critics out there. For sure. A lot of the daily paper people are still really good.
yeah.
And have been there either a long time, or even some of the newly arrived people are really, really talented and devoted. But I do think that there's an overall lack of enthusiasm for shit sandwiches.
Yeah. What about because there's so much of a global mix now, probably in part from streaming. Just what you're saying, is it the same for every genre, for hip hop, for blues, for country, for Latin music, or do you think all those things have their own, different writers and approaches to making opinions and saying what they want to say?
It's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to it, because I really haven't read a lot of that stuff. In fact, I read very little music journalism these days, because I've kind of read it all already, and B, I know it's a really awful thing to say. It doesn't have much impact on my life anymore, because I'm not really worrying about what the latest records are, or whether I'm gonna,
Yeah.
what my opinion is of that new release. So, it's a different kind of thing for me. But I certainly haven't read a lot of hip hop journalism, or folk music, or
Yeah.
there are outlets for all this stuff, and I'm glad there are. Certainly in the beginnings of hip hop journalism, it was pretty exciting, because it was an entirely, there was an enfranchised body of people who knew what they were talking about and had no connection to the previous world of music journalism.
Mm.
They weren't fans of Paul Williams and and Grail Marcus and Lester Bangs. They didn't know who those people were. They just came up and kind of like, so all of a sudden you had like Greg Tate, and people like, James Bernard, who died recently, they just made it up themselves, which is great. I mean, the music needed its own voices and it needed its own means of commentary, and I think that happened.
Going back to a Who line, I mean, is rock dead? Is it still alive? And I wanted to chat about something called rockism as well, and kind of get your views on that.
Well, rockism is a term that has different meanings to different people. It was initially essentially a criticism of people whose view of music was so narrow that all they liked was rock, which is sort of a strange. I mean, obviously, I was guilty of that in the nth degree. I'm going to the electric chair on that one. As were a lot of my friends. I mean, what we liked other kinds of music. I mean, I'm a big bluegrass fan. I love the blues. I mean, there's things I don't care about in the music world. I don't listen to jazz. I don't listen to very much classical. But I could rhapsodize about the Brandenburg Concerto. But being a rock person suddenly became like a bad thing. Which was a little weird, and I think it created a self-consciousness among some music journalists who didn't want to be an ism. Like you kind of knew that it was bad to be an ist, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Nobody wants to be an ist unless you declare yourself an ist. So I think being called a rockist was it became kind of a cudgel to criticize people for their narrowness of view. And then it became worse, because then it became a tool for describing a degree of patronizing, oppressive male patriarchy,
Mm.
anti-women, anti-gay, anti-people of color. All you like is white rock music, so therefore you're a narrow-minded hypocrite, which is a problematic view, although not entirely unfounded in certain circles. And that got ugly. And what kind of transpired after that was this idea of poptimism, which was sort of like that pop music, in all its many forms, was good,
Mm.
in a way that had not been accepted by rock people. So like the idea is like, okay, so you're a Van Halen fan who thinks that Britney Spears is garbage, right? Then the poptimists came along and said, you're so narrow-minded, why don't you understand how great Britney Spears is? And okay, it's an interesting dialectic, but where it got weird, and this I wrote about this last year, and this again is a subject of misunderstandings, because there's two very different views of what poptimism means. And in my view, poptimism is this sort of like happy-go-lucky, everything is good. If it sells records, it must be worth hearing, which is sort of the Taylor Swift, ideology.
Mm.
Whereas my view, I've always thought that pop music should be taken seriously. I mean, I pitched, the New York Times on a Destiny's Child article many years ago, saying that I thought they were going to be the next Supremes, in a modern context.
Yeah.
And got no traction there because they didn't really think that was something they wanted to write about. But I think pop music can, I think the New Yorker pop critics can always write about Britney Spears or Taylor Swift. I think any cultural creation is worth critiquing.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily worth liking, however, or admiring, and I think where poptimism and I diverge is whether just because it's successful, it has to be taken seriously. I think it's been a watchword of my entire career as a critic to have commercial success out of the equation.
Mm.
Like I have never thought about whether a record is selling, has sold, or will sell,
Yeah.
in terms of my appreciation of it. And I got myself into big trouble because of that once when I reviewed Nirvana's Nevermind for Rolling Stone, when I said, here's a band that sounds really great, but it's never going to sell any records.
So, I think we touched on this a bit, and I don't want to hit on it too much if it's not, whatever in your ballywick, but, just, I've spent a lot of time empowering streaming services around the world, actually. And I think what's happened now is something gets on a playlist, the kids hear a beat. It's depending, it can be from Central America or France, or obviously Korea is a big source of pop music these days as well. How does journalism fit into that? Do you think it's about a local journalist in, say, South Korea who really knows, K-pop in great detail? Or is it easy to write anywhere you are in the world now and still have the same, valid opinion?
I kind of think that I'm freestyling here because I haven't really thought about this before, but I kind of think that you need to be in the culture that your receivers are in. You know,
Yeah.
I think if you're going to write about K-pop, it would help to be at least inhabiting America, whether that means you're Korean American or a Korean or an American non-Korean, it doesn't matter, I don't think. But I think if you're going to write about K-pop, for instance, for an American audience, it would help to be in America because otherwise you're going to end up comparing apples and oranges. You're going to be contextualizing something in a context that people don't understand. Like
Uh,
if you're just going to describe, salsa music to people who don't know what salsa music is, there's no real point in explaining it if your context is going to be, 100 years ago before there was salsa in our country, say it's,
right.
Argentina, this is what it was like. And it's like, well, I don't know what that was like either. So,
Yeah.
but I stick to my guns. And I think anybody who's a competent critic and does the work can grapple effectively with any piece of art.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I spent a bunch of years with Sony Music and they sent me to Latin America and I kind of got schooled in Latin music when I went there, and it was radically different than what the American perception was. They had
Hmm.
similar genres. Sertanejo, might sound like American country music, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, bands like I'll mention Soda Stereo. You mentioned Argentina, which was like U2 of that territory. Phil Stadiums, and
Hmm.
he's passed. Their career, but a lot of Americans don't even know them. I don't know if I've ever
Right.
read a review from an American journalist about Soda Stereo, and this band had such impact on audiences, not just in Argentina, but throughout that region, presumably globally as well.
Well, I think what's interesting is that, what I think is important is that the internet has made those artists all over the world available. And I think, I mean, there was a big surge in interest in African music long before the internet. So, people did put in the people with curiosity and enthusiasm and ability put in the work and really, brought those artists to America and brought their music to America. And I think that was a really wonderful thing. I mean,
Yeah.
Paul Simon didn't invent, township music,
Mm.
but I think now it's so much more flexible and fluid that a lot of things can move around the world. And I think that's great. I think, you shouldn't, you don't have to know who the important band in Turkey is right now, but if you hear it and you like it, that's great.
Yeah. Do you think the album review is still as important as it used to be to whether it's discovering music or bringing, new artists out to audiences, or it's just been diluted?
I don't think so because there's so many other ways. One of the reasons Trouser Press ended was because MTV was able to play the music for people that we were writing about, and we could only tell them about it. And words are not the most apt way of sharing art. They're a very good way of understanding it. But if what people want to know is, am I going to like this record enough to want to hear it again? Then a click of a button is a whole lot easier than reading a review. I mean, the same reason why so much journalism now is done on video. Like, and I'm old school. Like, there's no way I'm going to watch a 6-minute video when I could read a 3-minute article. I mean, just tell me what the story is. I don't really need to watch the artist. I mean, here we are, doing exactly that. But I mean, I'm willing to acquiesce in this world. But I think album reviews, it's going to be very hard to maintain the value of album reviews for other than people my age or your age, Seths, who still kind of are amused by seeing what somebody has to say. But I mean, because you can listen to the record online, for free.
Yeah. Well, it still matters to me to have people who are informed, but I hear you. Um, Couple of last things before we close. I mean, what I know we talked about past history, but you're still working on current projects around publishing and books and Trouser Press. And tell me what's next for you, what your current activities are, and how our listeners can find and discover some of this.
Well, 3 years ago, when I retired from my day job, I started Trouser Press Books, and we've published 20 titles so far, all music titles. A couple of them are about 4 novels included in there, but the rest of them are all nonfiction music titles. And basically entered a major distribution deal, so we should have books in bookstores starting next month. We have 5 books coming out this fall, and you can find out more at www.trouserpressbooks.com. Uh,
Excellent. And so that's great. I wanna close on 2. I don't know if they're one of them total non sequitur, but we
go
have, I
for it.
think, one is, a mutual love for, a band that I grew up with, the American Fab Four Cheap Trick, and I don't know if you're still close with them, but I know you've written liner notes for them and have a great relationship with them, and just thought to mention them if you're working on anything with them lately or been in touch with those guys.
No, the last thing I really did with them was when Rick Nielsen had his exhibit at the Burpee Museum in Rockford. I wrote the program book notes. I went out and interviewed them for some stuff and did a timeline that they put on the wall and stuff like that. But yeah, we haven't really been in touch lately. They haven't really been in New York, and I think they've been going through a bunch of stuff, age-related things.
Yeah.
But, they're great guys, and I really still, they put out a record this year, and it's really good, so God bless them.
Ira Robbins, this has been a great pleasure talking to you. I'm definitely going to check out all these new books and initiatives, and I hope everyone on the call does as well. Thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Thanks, Seth. Let's not wait for another 40 years.
Agreed.